welcome everybody. It is a great privilege to have Gillian Hart amidst us this afternoon. And it's also really personally a great pleasure to be doing the honors of inviting her to the Institute. And in fact, when Gandhi said that there was this likelihood that she would be in India, there may be a small chance that we could bring her to Bangalore, I said, let's go and grab that opportunity. So, it's, of course, on behalf of the Institute, I'd like to thank Gillian for being with us. And, as the Dean of Faculty, that's an official duty that I have to do. But more than that, I think there's a strong personal attachment to Gillian, in the sense that, I've known her for 20 years. She was my former teacher, or she remains a teacher in the sense that I continue to learn from some of her work. And she's an extremely well-regarded scholar. And while I've certainly not read all her work, what little I've read is a model of excellent, rigorous scholarship that combines very detailed empirical study with strong theoretical grounding. And more than anything else, it's a model of clarity in sharp distinction with a lot of the obfuscation that passes off a scholarship in a lot of the social sciences these days. So I think it's a model that we could all sort of learn from. Of course, Gillian was also a teacher. I took maybe a couple of classes, or maybe 3 with her when I was in Berkeley. And there's an awful lot that I learned, and she was such a wonderful teacher that kind of a role model that I always think of when I step into the classroom. Right? Very great sort of clarity in explanation and exposition. And like I was telling her earlier in the afternoon, there are a couple of things that she said, concepts that she taught me, although it's like almost 20 years ago, that still ring so clearly in my mind, in part because of how well she conveyed those ideas. As somebody who was interested in sort of the spatial organization production, but largely sort of in industry and manufacturing. One of her courses actually focused on sort of organization of production in agriculture, and all the the rich literature we introduced to the work of China and others gave tremendous insights and notions about how different varieties of tenure can exist. And in fact, in a project that Solly and I and Janaki were all part of, when you looked at the Bhumi project, these notions of how varieties of land tenure can continue to sort of coexist, the sort of historical, social antecedents, which also makes a sort of a certain stickiness, where fair market compensation is not enough for you to sort of get people to sort of part with their land, whatever the notion of fair market compensation might mean. Right? So that is one. And of course, the other thing I remember Gillian very often talking about, the notion of sort of multiple trajectories, where you sort of don't get stuck with sort of structuralist positions on one hand, and at the same time, you also, there's no sort of European fantasy of saying anything is sort of what's possible, and sort of thinking about how different sort of how people can sort of negotiate different outcomes. And while I never fully appreciated that as a graduate student, it came to sort of hit me when I was doing my own dissertation, where I looked at the multiple trajectories within what was considered to be a monolithic IT information technology industry in Bangalore. So the whole political economy, once you start to begin, you start to sort of understand the multiplicity of trajectories. So I think I won't sort of stand in the way, but between you and Gillian. But I guess what she's going to be talking about today is about these sort of multiple trajectories that we're witnessing between India and South Africa, and how, even if they are sort of seen sort of far removed, that there is at least some kind of conceptual interrelationship. So multiple intertwined outcomes or trajectories, I guess. So over to Gillian. Thank you so much, Gillian, for being with us.
So Balaji, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And it's just an incredible privilege for me to be here, and also very special because there are students from different generations. So Solly Benjamin from, it's going on 30 years.
Yes.
At MIT. Well, it's in the 80s, at least the late 80s, so not quite 30 years, but getting on for that. And then biology at Berkeley, and then Janaki also. We did courses together in the 2000s. And you know, one of the lovely things about getting old is having former students and become a senior generation. And I can't tell you how lovely it is to kind of see that happening. It's very special. You know, this is also for me a wonderful opportunity to try out some ideas on you. And I really want to emphasize that what I'm going to be talking about today is not a nice, neat, sort of well worked out talk. It really is work in progress. And I just want to say a little bit about this sort of thinking about India and South Africa in relation to one another. A couple of years ago, I finished a book on South. I've been since well, I should just give a little bit of history, because when I knew Solly, I was still working on Asia. I left South Africa in 1971, and I started going back in 1990 when the ANC was unbanned. And so I've been following, my work since then has really been following the transition in South Africa. And I've been trying to do that through concentrating on two funny little places halfway between Johannesburg and Durban that represent both apartheid era as well as historical processes of racialized dispossession, of the way the apartheid state tried to get industry to decentralize to these so-called Bantustan areas, but also how Taiwanese industrialists started moving in. So these are areas where you can see all these forces coming together, and they're two places 100 kilometers apart that look, on the face of it, look very similar, but actually have turned out to be very different. So I've really been sort of trying to trace the post-apartheid transition from the vantage point of these two places, not as case studies, but as I say, as vantage points of points where multiple forces come together. And the first book I wrote was called Disabling Globalization, Places of Power in Post-Apartheid South Africa, that was both thinking about these places in relation to one another, but also trying to think about East Asian connections and what work that could do. And that was really sort of the first phase of the post-apartheid transition, sort of 1994 to 2000. And then I really do think that 2001 represented a key turning point for a whole variety of reasons. And so the second book, which is called Rethinking the South African Crisis, really takes off from 2001 as a turning point and trying to think about the incredibly contentious, contradictory dynamics that have unfolded since then. And in writing that book, India was incredibly important. Although it didn't feature explicitly. And there were two dimensions of India that were incredibly important to my thinking. The one turned around Indian debates, because what I have found just incredibly rich and useful are the vibrant debates that go on in India, and I'll talk about one of them in particular. But the other thing is, and I'll talk more about this, it seemed to me that in both India and South Africa, actually 1990 was just a crucial moment, when all sorts of changes, and there are parallel converging and divergent dynamics in India and South Africa. And part of the reason why I think the Indian debates were so stimulating to me is that they were efforts to come to grips with these processes. You know, just very broadly speaking, liberalization of the economy, sort of new forms of democracy with the Mandal Commission and OBCs gaining some degree of recognition, and then multiple expressions of nationalism all happening at the same time. And these are very similar broad processes to what has been going on in South Africa. So the project that I'm involved in now is really trying to, in a more explicit way, think about India, South Africa in relation to one another. Not as, and so broadly speaking, comparative, but not as case A and case B, but rather in terms of what I've called relational comparison, that recognizes both the historical geographical specificities, but also the interconnections. And so what this talk is really an opportunity for me is to try and sort of push forward a bit on this project. And I'm going to be posing a series of questions, but what would be incredibly useful to me is comments, critiques, suggestions, etc. So as I say, this is work in progress, first and foremost. So, Janaki asked me to sort of focus around questions of globalization. And there's something particularly, and of course, the early 1990s is exactly the moment of, what has come to the age of globalization, although goodness knows it's been going on since 1492 or whatever, and probably before then as well. But there's also something really very fascinating to me about being in Bangalore and thinking about all of this, because of course Thomas Friedman's The World is Flat, starts off on the Infosys campus, right? Which I need to go take a look at. And I'll be making reference to Friedman. But what I would like to try to do in this talk today is really cover three sets of points. So first of all, I want to start off thinking about the whole question of understandings of globalization, and suggest that probably, so I don't know whether it's 98 or 93 or 95, but well over the 90s, when the term globalization is used, it is very, very often used along with the term impact. So, the question is, what is the impact of globalization? And what I want to do is I want to just sort of do a bit of work in terms of taking apart impact models and seeing what are the underlying assumptions that are going on there. And it's fairly straightforward. I mean, I'm going to be arguing that what goes on is a whole series of dualisms and binaries that this impact model sort of rests on. And the second point the second broad set of points I want to make is to try to bring out what are the problems and the limits of impact models. And firstly, I want to try to do this concretely in terms of thinking about India, South Africa in relation to one another. And then the third thing I want to do is to sort of come back to the whole question, well, what might an alternative frame of understanding look like, but a frame that sort of, in some sense, grows out of thinking concretely about India, South Africa. Because it seems to me the whole problem with impact models is it sets up abstractions that then get turned into bounded units of understanding, and the whole issue is what gets left out of all of that. Yeah? So just very briefly, it seems to me that what impact models do, by and large, is they set up this dualism of the global and the local. So here's the global out there, and here's the local down here. And then what they do very often, not always, but very often, is they say that what the global represents is a sort of an inexorable set of technological and market forces that take shape in the core of the global economy and then sort of just move out from there in a one-way direction and impact on, and if there's ever a dreadful verb, it's impact. But that's the way it's, impact on the local. So what is going on in this formulation is here are these active, dynamic global forces, whereas the local is seen as passive, as static, and as sort of recipient of these global forces. And you know, like, whenever one sees a dualism, they're almost always gendered, so that these active forces, of course, are masculine, and the passive local is feminine and has to kind of, you know, very often, how does one attract these global forces? Now, you know, this is where Friedman actually is interesting, because the sort of standard impact model sees the core of the global, Euro-America, as where this all happens. So I think there's actually something quite interestingly different about the way Friedman starts his story in The World is Flat on the Infosys campus, because it's a different version. Because what it's saying actually, where he sort of has this incredible insight that the world is flat, and he calls his wife up and he says, "Honey, the world is flat." And it's actually a very funny book in a lot of ways. But so, you know, he's getting past the sort of Euro-central, Euro-American centric, the Western-centric character of a lot of these global narratives. But at the same time, what he's also doing is reinvoking another dualism, which is a flat world and an unflat world. And he says, of course, I realize that not all the world is flat, you know, that there are unflat bits. And he talks about traveling through some of the unflat bits to get to the Infosys campus. But really his argument about this unflat world is that it's got problems. It's too sick, it's too ignorant, it's lacking in skills, etc., etc. But that, you know, if the unflat world could get its act together, could be absorbed into the flat world, and everybody would sort of move into this wonderful flat future. So what I want to do is to start sort of thinking about taking apart these binaries through which all these models operate, I would argue, and thinking about what something different might look like. And you know, that is where thinking a little bit more about this age of globalization, what was going on from 1990 onwards, is really important. So, you know, this of course is the moment of the end of the Cold War. You know, it's the moment when the fall of the Soviet Union, the Russian Revolution that had dominated much of the 20th century sort of disintegrates. And it's a moment of the sort of triumph, on the one hand, of instead of talking about neoliberalism, I actually find it more useful to talk about neoliberal forms of capitalism, of a particular form of market capitalism, which of course had been taking shape since the 1970s, but really comes into its own after 1990. And this, of course, is, you know, what is so interesting about India and South Africa is that it's in both India and South Africa that the parties of liberation sort of institute neoliberal forms of capitalism. It's the Indian National Congress and the African National Congress that are really ushering in. And what's interesting also is that India and South Africa are a little bit late. If you think about Latin America, the 80s, the context of the debt crisis, structural adjustment, in big swathes of Latin America and Africa, neoliberal forms of capitalism really started coming in much earlier in the context of structural adjustment adjustment, stabilization, the debt crisis. So India and South Africa represent a sort of a somewhat late phase of neoliberal forms of capitalism. And more generally, not just India, South Africa, but if one goes back to this age of globalization, it's also the moment of triumph not only of neoliberal forms of capitalism, but also very much of liberal democracy. So, and here is, 1989, 1990, Francis Fukuyama writes The End of History, right? This argument that the whole world is converging on neoliberal forms of capitalism and liberal democracy. And that he's saying it's not that nothing else will ever happen, but that there's no alternative, that this is a linear trajectory and you're either further along or you're backward and need to move. But it's a reinstatement really of modernization theory, saying there's one path and you're at different points along the path. And this is the sort of one of the allied sets of understandings of the age of globalization. But it seems to me what's also really important and interesting, and thinking about India, South Africa really brings this out, is that it's the moment of the collapse of post-World War II projects. And here is where I think there's an interesting set of relationships, because what happens, of course, 1947-48 is Nehruvian development gets set up as this post-colonial project. What is weird about South Africa is that as decolonization is going on in Asia and then subsequently into the 50s and 60s in Africa, of course, apartheid takes hold in South Africa in 1948. But, in some sense, apartheid is also, in some sense, a project of development, but it's separate development along racial and ethnic lines. And I think what's also interesting when thinking about India, South Africa, 47-48, is that they're also both projects of partition. And in South Africa, India, Pakistan, but South Africa gets carved up into these crazy Bantustans that says that represent 13% of the land area, and black South Africans can only be citizens of the Bantustans, not of white South Africa. So they are both these major projects that take hold in the immediate post-World War II period that are actually being dismantled. And what 1990 represents in both of them is the dismantling of these projects. But I think the other thing that's interesting is how in both India and South Africa, the late 1960s, early 70s is also a moment when these post-World War II projects really begin to unravel in interesting ways. So that after Nehru dies, all the stuff that goes on in India over the 70s, 80s, the emergency, et cetera, et cetera. What's going on in South Africa in that period is from really the early 1970s onwards. The 60s in South Africa had been a period of just incredible repression. And what starts to happen in the early 1970s is the resurgence of a militant labor movement. And remember that, of course, the African National Congress, the South African Communist Party, the Pan-Africanist Congress had been banned in the early 60s. In 64, Mandela, large swathes of the ANC leadership was jailed, the ANC went into exile. 60s, this period of incredible repression, but things start to sort of break through in the early 1970s, first with the labor movement, Then with the student movements, the Soweto uprising, and then from the late 70s, 80s, just incredible sort of opposition to apartheid, and that both within South Africa as well as globally. And this is the period also when the Nehruvian model is still there, but it's also sort of coming under pressure. So it seems to me that what's interesting about the early 1990s is that these forces that start to bubble up in the 70s and 80s, really 1990, 91 is the moment when they get reconfigured. Yeah? And that what we see happening is the institution of neoliberal forms of capitalism in both places, and I want to say a little bit more about that in a minute, number one. Number two, what is going on is, I think the Mandal Commission is just enormously significant. And the way in which caste does not just go away, but actually in the struggles in the 70s and 80s, that caste has actually sort of become a huge issue, that the Mandal Commission then sort of sets in place with a formal recognition of OBCs. And this, of course, is the moment when race struggles in South Africa, struggles around apartheid, sort of culminate in Black South Africans being recognized for the first time. It's the first time that Black South Africans ever get to vote in 1994. So that certainly, I mean, of course, India has had democracy for a long time. This is the moment when liberal democracy takes hold in South Africa. But I think what's interesting is that what one sees with caste and race in South Africa is forms of democracy, of popular mobilization that actually exceed any sort of narrow Western notion of liberal democracy also going on. And then the third thing that is so interesting and significant about what's the parallel process is the whole question of resurgent nationalisms that have also been sort of bubbling up in the 70s and 80s. But from a South African perspective, I mean, what is fascinating about India is the way in which Hindu nationalism, which following Gandhi's assassination seems to have sort of gone underground, begins to re-emerge in the 70s and 80s. And of course, in the early 1990s, becomes a major political force in India. And what is happening in South Africa at this point is that African nationalism, which has been actually a very important part of what the struggle against apartheid has been about, really comes into its own when the ANC takes over, when the African National Congress takes over. And one of the arguments that I make in my book is that part of what is so important about nationalism in South Africa in this period is that when, at the moment of liberation, in the early 1990s, when the African National Congress is unbanned, that the South African nation actually did not exist. It had to be produced. And that what the role of the African National Congress was really to produce the nation. And what I do in the book is I argue they do this through multiple expressions of nationalism, starting off with Mandela and Tutu and the Rainbow Nation, this wonderful sort of inclusive, redemptive vision of a new nation in which we're all rainbow people together. which, you know, on one hand is not just top-down and cynical. It actually taps into South Africans, it taps into deeply held religious sentiments by very large numbers of both black and white South Africans. And what Mandela and Tutu did was to tap into these feelings and sentiments and bring them together. And this Rainbow Nation, it fell apart largely, I think, because of the persistence of white racism. But it was certainly a very important part of what producing the South African nation was about. There are sort of two other dimensions there are many, many expressions of nationalism that have gone into all of this. But the second really interesting one is that just at the moment that this redemptive Rainbow Nation was going on, what was also happening was that the African National Congress government actually adopted some of the most regressive apartheid-era immigration legislation, the so-called Aliens, the Aliens Immigration Act, that created what some scholars have called Fortress South Africa. That historically, people from other parts of Africa had actually moved in and out in quite a fluid way as part of a cheap labor force on the mines. And what this immigration legislation started to do was to set up increasingly repressive immigration legislation that has played very directly into xenophobia, which is, and the xenophobic killings, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard about, which has been another part of the expressions of nationalism. But a third really crucial dimension of post-apartheid nationalisms has been the way in which the African National Congress very effectively invokes the idea of the ANC as being, in some sense, the creator of saving South Africa from apartheid. And there's no question that the ANC was very important in this, although of course what that leaves out is a lot of what was actually happening on the ground in South Africa. But it's these invocations of the nation and liberation that are hugely important to the way in which the ANC is able to exercise hegemony, to generate consent among a very broad swathe of the black South African population. And you know what I call this in my book are processes of re-nationalization, that these multiple expressions of nationalism are part of this process of producing the South African nation. So I just want to say something more about the whole question of neoliberal forms of capitalism, and how that is played out in South Africa in ways that I think are very different to those in India. So, you know, here's what I think is when we think about this moment of the early 1990s, of the way in which neoliberal forms of capitalism take hold. And think about this, this didn't come from nowhere. And it wasn't just sets of global forces bearing down. Both in India and South Africa, there were complex political, economic dynamics that ushered in these neoliberal forms of capitalism. And here is where I think there's a really interesting set of parallels, but also contrasts between India and South Africa, which is as follows. It seems to me what's really interesting about India from a South African perspective is that 1940s, the development project in India was very much about an autarkic economy, right? A relatively closed economy. And this relatively closed economy over the 1980s is beginning to open up. And this, of course, is where information technology is so hugely significant. And the role of Rajiv Gandhi in all of this is hugely significant. So that over the 1980s, you get these pressures building up within India to what I call denationalize the economy, to open it up. And that this is what happens in the early 1990s. But and of course there are complex forces that play into, I realize there are complex political forces with the BJP and the INC of playing into that moment in 1991. But there is this sort of force that has been building up in the 80s. What's interesting about South Africa is that South Africa historically is an open economy, based in mining. That this is the whole basis of the South African economy is what has been called the minerals energy complex, that is grounded in the enormous mineral wealth, which is why the bloody Brits took it over around the turn of the century. And India, South Africa are both key outposts of the British Empire at the turn of the 20th century. So that the South African economy has historically been relatively open. But over the 1980s, it was being closed. And that was through sanctions, divestment, the crisis of the apartheid state, exchange controls. And so the South African economy was being sort of closed down in the 80s. And just as there are particular sets of forces in India that are clamoring to open up the economy, South African corporate capital as a whole really wants to open. They are, by the mid-80s, they are fed up with the apartheid state. It's a disaster as far as it served them pretty well for quite a while. And then they said, to hell with this. It's not doing anything very useful at all. We've got to get rid of it. It was really capital that initiated discussions with the ANC in the late 1980s. It was very clear that without that initiative from capital, that 1990 wouldn't have, the unbanning of the ANC in 1990 would not have happened in the way it did. But at that moment in 1990, when the ANC was unbanned, there were 5 huge conglomerates in South Africa that controlled 85% of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. And these conglomerates were grounded in mining, then diversified into industry, into retail, into insurance, into finance. And this very powerful force is they wanted to liberalize the economy. And although it was only in 1996 that formally neoliberal economic policies came in, it's very clear now that from the early 1990s, there were actually secret, South Africans are conspiracy theorists, but sometimes we're right. And that what's becoming evident now is that there were secret meetings that were going on with a very small, quite conservative faction of the ANC meeting with corporate capital. And this, again, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were there, but it was not just World Bank led. It was corporate capital in South Africa that was driving this process in a very fundamental kind of way. And, this has had hugely important implications for the way for what has happened over the course of the post-apartheid era. Because what we have actually seen is growing inequality. Dramatically growing inequality. And if it were not for, and one of the reasons why the early 2000s is an important turning point is that this is the moment when the ANC is beginning to realize that things are really serious. Because what opening up the South African economy meant was that cheap goods very quickly started coming in from China. And I was doing field work in these funny places. I was seeing it happen. And I can tell you stories, if anybody wants to ask me stories about what happens when to Taiwanese industrialists, when stuff, identical stuff, produced by Taiwanese industrialists in China starts flowing into South Africa. What we see is the very rapid collapse of labor-intensive industry, which, by the way, the apartheid state itself had actively cultivated and subsidized. And so dramatically increasing unemployment over the second half of the 1990s. At the same time that in the name of austerity, the ANC government was slashing spending on local government. And one of the things we've actually come to realize is that the apartheid state actually poured a lot of money into these crazy Bantustans. And that then gets cut off. And as these Bantustan areas get incorporated into defined local government areas where former white towns and black townships get put together, there's now incredible pressure on local government finances, which means that water and electricity charges skyrocket. There is huge popular anger around all of this. And things just explode. And from the early 2000s onwards, what the ANC government is trying to do is pour more money into local government, which they do, and more money into social grants. Now, you know, here's where the contrast with India, I think, and by the way, the other thing that's going on, we now, you know, there's now quite solid evidence, is massive increasing capital flight. So that huge amounts of money are being sort of just pumped out of South Africa. Corporate capital, some of the biggest corporations relocate on the London Stock Exchange. The ANC just basically opens the door to, it says, please, you know, go. And this is where, of course, the contrast with India is quite dramatic. And I mean, it seems to me that what has happened in India is actually serious accumulation has gone on within in India in a way that has not happened. So that liberalization of the economy has meant very different things in India and South Africa, that there has in fact been this incredible economic growth, you know, partly driven by IT, but I think by a bunch of other things as well. But what is really interesting, I think, is that what this has been accompanied by is sort of growing dispossession. And that this is where dispossession from the land, I think, has been a hugely significant dimension of what Indian economic growth has been about. In South Africa, dispossession started happening hundreds of years ago. Of course, it speeded up in the area of the minerals discoveries, and it's speeded up even further under apartheid. But you know, we haven't seen dispossession in the same form. But what actually has emerged both in India and South Africa are these. What is interesting then about these surplus, about dispossession in India, is that even though there's been rapid accumulation, it's not rapid enough to absorb dispossession. And so in both India and South Africa, we've seen the formation of, you know, and I use scare quotes here, surplus populations, who cannot actually, who are in some sense surplus to the needs of capital. Now, you know, it's this, and you know, so, you know, to come back to Thomas Friedman, you know, the flat world and the unflat world are not separate. They actually produced each other in some interesting kinds of ways. You know, this is where I have found the work of Partha Chatterjee, for instance, very interesting. And I've argued with Chatterjee, but I've just found, so one of Chatterjee's big arguments in an article in Economic and Political Weekly in 2008 is that what India under liberalization looks like is that increasingly what has happened is the development of what he calls civil society and political society. Civil society for Chatterjee refers to the urban middle classes who are hooked into the global economy. Political society is the rural and urban poor who are governed in a different kind of a way. So that and his whole argument is, and he draws on Kalyan Sanyal in this, is an argument about how India in the era of liberalization is all about trying to reverse the effects of dispossession by redistributing from the sort of corporate economy into political society, so that in the way in which India under liberalization has tried to operate is through these efforts to reverse the effects of what he calls primitive accumulation. I think is much more usefully called dispossession, and that this is sort of the model of India since the 1990s. And this understanding is very widely, many in South Africa see this as an incredibly compelling explanation of what is going on in South Africa. It's a model that you can just pop onto South Africa, where you know, the spatial racial inequalities just hit you in the face. I was talking about typology about that. I mean, inequality in South Africa is just dramatic. Yeah? And what we've seen is the formation of a small, powerful African capitalist class, of a fairly solid African middle class, but then the large majority of black South Africans who are in this sort of pool of who are in some broad sense not needed by so former President Thabo Mbeki, just around the time that in a set of moves that are very similar to Chatterjee, what Mbeki said was that South Africa is composed of a first economy and a second economy, and the first economy is highly educated, tied into the global economy, etc. The second economy, he said, is not needed in terms of accumulation, but needs to be somehow taken care of. And so this is one of the ways in which Chatterjee's formulation actually becomes compelling in South Africa. So that my sort of first step in this project has been to say, actually, no, that if we apply Chatterjee's model in South Africa, what we leave out are hugely important dynamics going on in South Africa, and I suspect hugely important dynamics going on in India as well. So, you know, just to put it very crudely, the argument that I try to make in my book is that these efforts since the early 2000s by the ANC government to try to deal with growing popular anger and discontent have involved significantly increased spending on both social grants and local government. But that what I've tried to show, and there's no question that the social grants have in some sense helped keep the lid on things to some degree. Without those social grants, I think South Africa would have exploded in really quite violent political upheavals. But when you get to the question of local government, it's much more complicated. And one of the things that I've tried to show with this long-term ethnographic research, and I'm just going to do this very briefly, but I'd be happy to sort of talk more about this. And so I'm going to just make an outrageous generalization, which is that actually there's reason to, and I can show it at least in one particular set of, that these efforts to try to contain popular discontent. Well, let me be more concrete. In one of the places in both of the places where I've been working, these efforts to contain popular discontent through a complicated set of circuits have actually fed into and inflamed the very conditions that have fed into further exacerbating popular anger. And one very important example of this turns around water meters. And part of what the ANC government said was, we are going to set in place municipal indigence policy, which will involve giving free basic water and free basic electricity to poor people. In these former black townships, especially those that were, well, in fact, in all these former black townships, the way things operated under apartheid was that people were expected to pay a basic flat fee for water and electricity. And in order to institute, and that what started happening in the 90s was setting in place water meters and electricity meters. And these have been incredibly contentious. That these technologies of measuring water and electricity have, in situations where people are used to paying a flat fee, which very often they actually didn't pay in any case, but this is part of what apartheid was subsidizing, right? And what I was able to trace in the places where I worked was as follows. People had been brought into these townships from surrounding rural areas in the 1960s and 70s. There had been this massive pulling people off the land in so-called black spots in white South Africa, putting them into these huge townships on condition that people would get housing, very basic housing, water, electricity, lights, etc. Putting electricity water meters into this situation, people experienced as profound, as a further round of dispossession. And that I think that one of the arguments I make in my book is that what is going on in post-apartheid South Africa is that local government has actually become the key site of contradictions. It is the arena within which poverty has to be managed. But that these efforts to manage poverty are actually, in some sense, close to impossible. And that the real danger of applying a Chatterjee model on this type of situation just washes over the way in which these efforts to sort of deal with surplus populations actually doesn't work, or certainly doesn't work in the way that it was intended. And, you know, it seems one of the questions that I want to pose is, what might this then mean within an Indian context? And this, and number one. And number two, just more broadly, and I'm going to stop talking now because I really would like to get some sort of critical feedback. So that it seems to me to sort of go back to impact models. I think what I've been trying to say all along is that what an impact model or what a flat earth model does is it abstracts from the way in which liberalization itself is not just about technology and markets. It's about social power relations that shape the particular ways in which liberalization, etc., happens. The technology and markets are mediated through these historically, geographically specific forms of power relations that can take different forms in different places. But that they, and this is the part that I haven't been able to sort of flesh out because I don't have time here. But in the South African context, what I try to argue is also really important is that it's not just liberalization or neoliberal forms of capitalism. It's also these forms of both liberal democracy, but popular democracy that exceeds any understanding of liberal democracy. It's also about expressions of nationalism and how they all come together. So that in the South African context, what my argument is that one of the crucial ways in which the ANC government exercises hegemony or legitimacy is precisely by invoking its role in the national liberation struggle, in the nation and liberation, the ANC as the savior of Black South Africans from apartheid. And this is a set of expressions of discourses that actually have powerful popular resonance because they speak to experiences of racial oppression and racialized dispossession. And this is what I call part of the way in which renationalization is happening. But at the same time, denationalization, that these calls to sort of popular support are actually a double-edged sword because they go hand in hand with the ANC's claim to creating a better life for all. And so that they open the ANC up to charges of betrayal. And that what is happening with these processes of denationalization is that they create conditions in which these charges of betrayal actually have, with the huge inequalities that they help to produce, sort of feedback into generating these deep contradictions. So that part of the sort of, to put it really crudely, that the capital in South Africa needs the ANC to keep the lid on things, which it tries to do with expressions of denationalization, but that these dynamics of denationalization are creating actually the conditions of impossibility for that. And what we're seeing is actually an extremely, I think, volatile set of dynamics that are emerging out of all of this. So, I'm not even, I can't even be, it seems to me something different is going on in India. But maybe I'll just stop here and sort of open up to, I would love to get your reactions, critiques, etc. I want to pick your brains, put it this way.
I have a couple of observations. One is that your definition of what would be called as nationalization, you seem to use it a kind of homogeneous concept right through the time. Like the nationalization, as you understood, as an opposition to colonizing powers who colonized resources in the 18th and 19th century. And that kind of nationalization, I think the nationalist thought or emergence of nationalism is different from, I would say, the kind of nationalist thought or a nationalist response now you get, where the colonizing is not of resources but of mind. The concept of Western liberal democracy or capitalism or the universal, there are some universal principles, unique, universal and intrinsically progressive principles, which is what leads to the end of history. I think this nationalism is quite different. The response to this is from the ANC or the INC kind of nationalism, which came up as an answer to colonizing of resources. For example, the Indian independence struggle is a response to the colonizing of resources. So if you see the responses to the colonizing through ideas or dominant ideologies, you would find that this use of the same tools of whatever tools that let's say the Western thought leaders use to oppose the Western thought leadership. The media, the use of the media is virtually identical. For example, I would say that in 1930s or 1925, a way of nationalism in India was to quit using anything produced by the imperialist power. There was this question of burning of the cloth imported from England. We had it as a movement, and returning the degrees awarded by the British educational system. So many people who dropped out of the university. That you actually opposed everything that system produced. But now it's the case. The current nationalism is very different. You use the same thing which is produced by that system to oppose that system. So I think this distinction you have to see and see whether the current nationalist struggles in South Africa and India is of different class or different kind. Second is again your concept of dispossession. If you really look at the dispossession as in absolute terms of resources, let's say acres of land, dispossession between 1947 and 1980 is 10 times more than post-1980 in this country. All our major projects, the River Valley projects, the public sector mining projects, all came before that. The scale of dispossession of fundamental resources was much larger. But the thing is, it was not felt. The feeling of dispossession is much larger now. If I even want 60 feet of my land, I protest vehemently, whereas people have gifted away hundreds of acres together for some scheme or the other. So I think one has to look at the dispossession in slightly different categories altogether, not in absolute.
No, I absolutely take your point, and I was being very sort of synoptic and very cryptic and crude, but there's actually there's an article in EPW a little bit earlier this year by a guy by the name of Michael Levian, who's another one of the Berkeley mafia, a sociologist who teaches at Johns Hopkins, who has a piece on exactly this issue and saying, under Nehru, there was actually massive dispossession for these huge national projects that, and I think you're saying that people could in some sense buy into, whereas the dispossession that's happened since the 1990s is of a very different...
I would not say buy into. I think the social consciousness of the people who possessed those resources which were taken away from them at that time was quite different from the relationship between the concept of the state and the concept of an individual has undergone change. For example, in the 1930s, the Maharaja of Mysore could simply make a kind of an order and everybody would obey. But that legitimacy for a crown or legitimacy for Jawaharlal Nehru for all practical purposes was a crown. So the legitimacy for a crown went away in the over a period of 3 decades. I think you have to also look into the legitimacy and the authority of the political power.
No, absolutely, and you know, that's in some sense that's exactly the point I'm trying to make here. That gets washed out with these simplistic binary models is exactly the particular configuration of political forces that can take different and changing forms. And you know, I of course also take your point. I mean, it seems to me part of what the way I interpret your first point about colonization is that there's a difference between anti-colonial nationalism and what happens in the post-colonial period.
Yes.
And that one of the interesting questions then is that I think both in much of Asia and in Africa, although the history of Latin America is different, is that popular classes in the context of anti-colonial struggles are mobilized. And that one of the issues in the post-colonial period is almost always a process of some degree of demobilization. And this is very much what we've seen in South Africa, is an effort in the 1990s to demobilize popular forces who were very much actively involved in the struggle against apartheid. And what we're seeing now is, you know, the traces of those struggles sort of re-emerging. And, you know, that is where there are sort of interesting debates around this in India. I mean, Sudipta Kaviraj's work, I think, is extremely interesting around this, is what happens in the how are post-colonial nationalisms in India different from the period of anti-colonial nationalism. So, you know, I recognize that there's a large body of very sophisticated work on this in India from, you know, that I think is part of what makes thinking India, South Africa in relation to one another so rich.
Yeah, to pick up on the point that he made about you know, legitimacy and so on. One of the things I think, you know, in the Nehru era, let's say the first 30 years after, or 25 years probably you can say, the post-independence era, I mean, you still had the Congress which had the aura of having won
right.
the independence for the country. Nehru was literally a colossus, particularly after the death of Patel and Gandhi, right? He
right.
sort of, he parted ways with Rajaji and Ambedkar also, and then, you know, there was a certain sort of status that he had. But the state, the Congress-led state started to lose its legitimacy, and by the 1980s you started to see fragmentation, so you started to see the rise of regional parties sort of asserting themselves all over the country, and you could, the Congress no longer had the sort of the political legitimacy or the hegemony that it once held.
Right.
You know? So the legitimacy of the state started to be challenged precisely because the Nehruvian project started to unravel, and people didn't see the kind of benefits of supporting the state that they once had. And in the 1990s, so what happened, I think this is the way I would look at it. You started to then see a battle to see who is going to grab this this sort of vacuum or this space left in the list. So you have these two battles going on. One, to draw a parallel with South Africa, you see the Congress still invoking the fact that, you know, we fought and won independence. We lost, you know, Mrs. Gandhi was assassinated for the country, Rajiv Gandhi was assassinated for the country, and they keep invoking this. And in fact, Sonia Gandhi said, I am Mrs. Gandhi's daughter-in-law. How can you question me? Right? So you see them continuously invoking this.
So that's, so in some, you know, that's where one of the parallels is. So that the dynasty is actually, that's very interesting.
So the thing is, the Congress harks back to the fact that it won the independence for us, whereas the BJP, on the other hand, is sort of is saying, harks back to a time before that. Some imagined and says, look, this is, we are a Hindu nation and trying to construct that. And I think this whole notion of constructing a nation is very fitting, considering that Benedict Anderson passed away only yesterday.
Yes.
This whole thing about an imagined community, and you see what you said, that the Rainbow Coalition that the ANC is trying to put together, attempted to put together in South Africa, is not very different. I think that's what the in a sense the BJP is trying to do, is create a thing that some past which we are supposed to be expected to relate to. And so here you see this, this is between these two sources of potential sources of legitimacy and ideology in the country.
What's so interesting about this is that in South Africa, oppositional forces like Julius Malema and the economic freedom fighters are invoking the Freedom Charter, which was the ANC's Freedom Charter in 1955, which is one of the cornerstones of ANC legitimacy. And they're saying the trouble with the ANC is they're not living up to the Freedom Charter. So that, this is where oppositional forces, and this is maybe a difference, that there isn't, that where the BJP can go further back, there isn't actually the oppositional force don't have that option of going further back, right? The ANC was the first liberation movement in Africa, thanks in part to Gandhi, right? But what's so interesting there is exactly what pieces of the past, how the past is crucial in the present.
Or it's selectively being assembled.
Of course, in relation to the present.
I think we should also look at how technology gets appropriated and used by different ideas, different, let's say, interest groups or different political classes. So that's kind of a crucial thing. How do you use technology? How do you use media, especially on social media now? And also to look at how do you also use elements of markets. So for example, when do you use the concept, the little bit concept of the laissez-faire into your arguments, and when do you want the state control? And when do you want to have a mixed kind of a stuff, and for what purposes you want? And how do you develop a kind of narration which gets kind of universally accepted over a period of time? For example, if you really take into this country in India, I'm saying that in about 20 years' time, this concept that one should pay toll for using a road has been bought into. Toll all over all the highways, there are toll plazas and you pay the toll. How did it ever happen? Where did the technology play a role in this, and where did the media play a role? How was this happen? And it seems to be a kind of a narrative which is cutting across all divisions of political system or a class or a caste system. So how certain narratives get generated, and how those narratives use various elements of technology and the market to create a social narrative. And I think that, I don't know whether there is a parallel between, say for example, India and South Africa. But I heard that in South Africa, small crimes have really gone up in some of the poorer communities in the last 20 years.
Yeah, I've just seen some of that happen. But on the road tolls, there are e-tolls around Johannesburg now, where you just get automatically billed, and there are huge protests. I mean, there are just ongoing struggles over this. And people are willing to pay tolls on the major roads when there are other roads that they can use. But these e-tolls have just been the source of enormous popular anger. And the ANC has not been able to get them to stick.
I think that's partly over here also, like for example, the Expressway and other places that but this also comes back to a point that you were talking about, like on this so-called free water, free electricity, and then the flat rate. When you were talking about the details. But if I remember correct, about 8 years ago, when we started to look at in Bangalore, what is called the Greater Bangalore Water Supply, the GB WAS project. Bangalore Water Supply. This also had a South African link because one of the main people coming over from the World Bank actually came from South Africa to try out similar models within the bureaucratic arrangement, Junaid Ahmed, the water supply and sanitation program in the World Bank in Delhi.
What do you remember what year that was?
This must have been, I can give because some friends and I were preparing documents on analyzing this, so we have that somewhere. But it was about 2003, 2002, somewhere around that time.
That's exactly when the meter battles happened.
Because I think some of these technologies, including I think the thing that you were looking at, land titling, for example, but specifically on the water issues. I think one interesting issue here, and coming from Chennai, and this is sort of pre-flood time. So there's been big moves to rehouse people as part of urban renewal in Chennai. Huge one. Much actually, I think my impression is, because I would still see myself as a sort of Bangalore person, much bigger than Bangalore, but done in a more quiet way. One of the key points is that in terms of this rehousing under rehabilitation and resettlement of areas which have not worked here and have not worked there also, is that a lot of this subversion that happens through the bureaucracy. So unfortunately we don't have good ethnography which looks at how these technologies that are used to measure, to meter, get reworked. The only works that I can think of actually come from Bombay. Lisa Brockman's recent book, on water politics in Bombay. Earlier books were now put together in the book. Zainab Baba.
Yes, Zainab Baba has done interesting work.
And there are a couple of more, Catherine Tovey in the Delhi context. What I would call, really solid ethnographies do is to show the spaces that are created within the bureaucracy where the same technologies are appropriated. And one interesting movie for all of you might have seen it, which is on the electrical power supply system in Kanpur, where the person who's cutting or hooking the electrical line to give electricity to small industries has learned his job from the employees of the electrical office himself. So in a sense, this kind of appropriation of technologies working through the realm of touts, agents, usually called that way in a derogatory way, completely sort of critique Partha Chatterjee's very neat political society, civil society, a binary which basically washes away all kind of institutional politics. Because I mean, I have to go very long, but if you believe in that model and you're going out to research these, then there are impossible categories for it to research. You can't research this kind of politics because the political society and civil society will not allow you to enter this realm.
No, absolutely. And actually, I mean, exactly one of the points that I wanted to try to make is if one's interested in questions of technology, that rather than impact models, that a sort of critical ethnographic research can exactly enable one to understand much better how technology is entangled in complex social power relations, and how technology and social forces sort of change in relation to one another, and that there are just much more interesting ways of thinking.
The other way it speaks to this is also, you talked about the binary between global and local. And part of what Solly was saying about this guy, Junaid, whoever came from South Africa, is that a lot of these ideas are also reshaped in what you're calling the recipient local, right?
That's right.
So, and then they flow through to another local, I suppose. So that's the other thing that ethnographic work lets you do, is to see how some of these ideas actually flow and come through and are reworked.
Precisely. And exactly what a critical ethnography lets one do is see how the local is, the local, whatever that is not just a passive recipient, but is where actively productive forces are at play. And that what is so deadening about impact models is exactly what it screens out, is the way in which these reworkings, the ways in which space and place are not just passive, but are sort of actively produced. And it also, I think what a critical ethnography also does is it refuses an understanding of the local as a bounded unit, but rather thinks about, for instance, these places where I've been working, instead of thinking about them as bounded units, of thinking about them as points of coming together of multiple forces and relations that are always connected to what's going on elsewhere. And then the challenge is to understand what are the key relations and connections. So instead of what is the impact, what are the key relations and connections, and how are they being reworked in particular kinds of ways? And it seems to me that that just opens up research, infinitely more interesting sets of research possibilities. And it seems to me that that's where the work that both Sally and Janaki are doing it speak to exactly those kinds of issues.
There's also talking about this how this dichotomy, this Partha Chatterjee dichotomy is not necessarily. To give you a simple example, looking at some data on employment in the country. On one hand, there is this whole call for saying we have very rigid labor laws and that's hampering certain kinds of employment and so on. But actually, if you look at it, that is challenged because you see, since liberalization, or at least over the last 10 or 15 years, the amount of sort of informal employment in the country has actually been growing. Mm-hmm. And the percentage share of informal contracts in the formal sector has actually also been creeping up. So today, 93 or 94% of the country in the employable age is all in the informal sector. And that has actually grown from it was about 86, 87, late 80s, it has now crept up. So this whole question of saying, we need more flexible labor markets.
You've got them.
You've got them in the first place. What are we talking about? So the thing is, there is this, in a sense, it is partly the demands of the system that actually creates some of these outcomes. Right? So it's not clear what the cause and the effect. So it's not a simplistic thing to say that this is causing, and then there is this talk about saying, we are doing very capital intensive, skill intensive. That's only part of the story. But where are the origins of that? How does it actually, why do you actually do those things? Mm-hmm. What is creating this informal set of relationships? Those things I think are, the answer to that doesn't lie, I think, simply in terms of sort of looking at capital labor relations, but in sort of larger political economy where the state is actually prepared to invest. Right, for example, in certain kinds of skill development, and those things have really not happened because, for example, our investment in education in this country is an absolute disgrace. Manmohan Singh, when he took over, if you go to his 1991, this supposed path-breaking budget speech as a finance minister, said, at that time our investment in education was 3.5% of GDP, and he said we will hit that 6% mark, which is sort of the national norm. We're still not hitting 4%. So our investment in public education and things like that has really not. So the questions are not really about saying are we doing capital intensive or skill intensive and sort of formal informal, but I think the answers have to be sought elsewhere. Which means that these dichotomies,
just don't capture it. But the other thing that's so stunning about South Africa is that the sort of informal activities are so much more confined and constrained. And the possibilities for livelihood, I mean, it always strikes me when I'm in Asia how there are all these niches that people fit into in these incredibly creative ways. Whereas part of what has been so devastating about what actually is the highly concentrated character of South African capital is it's left very little space for these kinds of possibilities. And you know, retail is just one example. I mean, everybody buys their groceries from one of 5 big chains in South Africa. You know, you see people with little piles of oranges at the side of the road, but there's nothing like the sorts of range of ways in which people find livelihood. So this is one of the ways in which, you know, the collapse of labor-intensive industries was absolutely devastating because there isn't, the economy is structured in a very different way.
I think there's a sort of interesting kind of different kind of geographies that get opened up. I mean, in the sense, I mean, I'm just something that has struck me, and I think it's probably here too in Bangalore. But for example, if you think about, let's say, parts of Hong Kong, there's Hong Kong Island where you have what you would describe as a closure of various kind of possibilities, and then you just cross the strait and get into Kowloon, and it's certainly a very, very different place in which you know, work gets done. There are tenure form, there are a whole range of economies, there's whole pirate stuff happening. So I mean, I think it's interesting that if we look at spaces not being homogeneous but being shaped differently and without a sort of positivist, then you start to see how different kind of closures and openings happen, which I think is really interesting. I had a sort of question about going back to categories and linked to relational ways of thinking. Like if you're thinking about, I don't know, you know, Indian cities or towns and Chinese ones. I mean, how does one do this kind of research without boxing it into a locality of case studies, which itself, you know, goes a kind of classical anthropological way of closure. And so just your comments on that.
Well, you know, it seems to me exactly what is so problematic is starting with an idea of a pre-given bounded unit, and rather trying to think about these points of coming together. And when, of course, boundaries matter, but how they get produced is the interesting question. So it seems to me, you know, the short answer is asking questions of how questions, you know, how and exactly what that directs attention to is kind of everyday practices that seem so ordinary and mundane, but that actually contain the possibility, I think, of really important new insights. And that this is where sort of really encouraging, I mean, and there's, you know, there's so much happening all around us that actually has the potential for generating new kinds of understandings, right?
I think this is one thing, I mean, I don't know how is it here, but at least in a lot of educational system, the emphasis on the possibilities of doing field work is treated like a closure of a case, you know, basically to illustrate existing theory.
Yeah.
I think that's one thing which is dampening on a lot of student engagement, excitement, you know, where they can pick up things and then feel empowered to, in fact, critique the literature because they feel it's wrong.
Right.
Otherwise, there's a lot of discipline that happens.
Actually, Sally and I were talking about the difference between being a consumer of theory, where you take a theory and you go and apply it, as opposed to doing the kind of research that enables students to become active producers of theory who can speak back to taken for granted categories.
In fact, again, to go back to something I remember you were telling us a long time ago, there's a difference between doing a literature survey where you simply say A said this, B said this, and sort of looking up and sort of maybe chronologically or some form, whereas to actually critically engage with the literature to come up with a question that you then actually want to go out into the field and investigate, and then you're able to go back and critique the literature. So there is a very important difference between just reading up everything that there is to read up, and then reading it to say, I will pick on specific things to come up with a question that I want to sort of answer, engage with the field. Otherwise, there's no point in doing fieldwork.
But in some ways, it really involves a serious back and forth between theory and practice, because in order to be able to read the literature critically, one has to have some sense of what is going on in the realms of everyday life that will, for which a particular theoretical understanding is inadequate and in need of. But it seems to me that that is the kind of research that that students should be doing.
Just wanted to get your thoughts on this. When we accept the legitimacy of terms like globalization, are we not also in the process accepting those dualisms? When we say globalization to mean a particular localized form of whatever economy, governance, it's some sort of acceptance that that local is privileged over the others, and therefore it's a global, which is actually not global in the literal sense. It's a local which is trying to protect itself or trying to create that power or create that hegemony by using a term like global. And what we see today in the form of globalization is actually that, and probably a certain form of Western culture, or a certain form, even there, a particular rich, maybe American or rich European culture taking precedence over other, say, local, and projecting itself as a global. So global in the sense of global, global meaning, is not actually what probably is happening in some of these forms, and that's also probably comes out so starkly in these global conversations, and say the current climate conversation that's happening right now. Alternate voices, there are definitely those power relations going on. Local concerns to get rationalized, to get kind of captured certain projections of global, which in certain sense is actually certain privileged locals trying to capture the global agenda. So just trying to understand, when we start accepting terms like globalization, we're also, are we not buying into the dualisms that these proponents of growth or the privileged locals would want us to be?
No, look, absolutely. And I love this phrase, privileged locals capturing the global agenda. I think that puts it really neatly. And bloody, this is what Thomas Friedman is doing, right? He's saying, hey, it's all the same. And I think it's a perfect example of capturing a certain kind of agenda and screening out what may be alternatives. So absolutely. I think we should every time we hear the term globalization, all our critical faculties should be sort of standing out. And I think exactly there is precisely a set of built-in dualisms and hierarchies that accompany that term. So yeah, I mean, exactly what I think the whole point about, an exceedingly critical engagement with the language itself is hugely important.
Say the IT and development space, for example, we have a term called digital divide. Again, that
you have a term, sorry?
Digital divide.
Okay, yes.
That digital divide plays out in a lot of these negotiations. Negotiations. In fact, I was recently at a UN regional dialogue. The countries from the Asia Pacific, and most of the discussion was around how do we use the technologies that are being produced in Western society, and how best we should develop our capacities to be able to use them. And I did not see sense in terms of what kind of capacities are we trying to build here in terms of achieving
and for whom?
And for whom? And I think where it all comes from is the construction of the term digital divide. When you construct it like that, divide is there to be bridged. So
exactly. No, language matters enormously. It creates understandings and it screens out others.
Also formal and informal for that matter.
Of course.
95% of something is the informal.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Hi.
So I'm a layperson. I'm not a student of this topic. So my question will be very naive, maybe even irrelevant. So I'm talking from the perspective of a very ordinary person who is trying to find his way through this so-called globalizing world. On the one hand, every day I come across many people who work as, let's say, domestic helps or construction workers, who are essentially immigrants from so-called poor regions, and they are trying to find their livelihood in our places, and we are employing them in large numbers for our day-to-day convenience. Sometimes, or rather, quite often, we feel a little guilty that we are the reason of their disposition. In some sense, they have been reduced to daily wage workers in our localities, whereas they might have been poorer in their own respective contexts, but maybe they might have been richer in terms of, let's say, the culture, art, etc. So we do feel guilty to some extent that we have caused this displacement of a large volume of people who have lost their context and relevance, and they are trying to force fit themselves in a new context which is getting built around us. So that is one aspect of our lives. The other aspect of our lives is that we are researchers in this area of IT, where we sometimes, or rather often, are trying to solve problems we have no idea about. We just read some research papers, and we see that these are the areas which are being worked upon very heavily, and probably maximize our possibilities of getting published in so-called global fora. And we just work mindlessly, but we really stand no chance to compete against the forces who actually have a deep insight about those problems, which we are trying to solve. So, in some sense, I feel very similar to the same people whom I seem to have dispossessed. Both of us are struggling with the same problem. We all have been displaced. We all have been displaced. So is it a very natural phenomenon? Is it part of being a part of globalized world, or is it something which is malignant? Can you just help us find?
Well, I think the very way you're posing the question is extremely interesting and important, because it displays a sort of a critical understanding of things that, by and large are just taken for granted and seen as natural. So I think that the very question you've posed is actually a hugely important one. Yeah? And it seems to me that sort of starting from that critical insight is actually a very productive point from which to think about what are the possibilities for producing the kind of knowledge that would engage exactly those conditions. Yeah? And, you know, so on one level, one could say this is exactly where bringing social scientists and engineers and technology experts together is important. But I think that's not enough, because social scientists themselves use a very wide array of theoretical frames that include some things and exclude others. So I think actually the role that, a really important role that non-social scientists could play is holding social scientists' feet to the fire in terms of really asking the question that I hear you posing, which is what are the political stakes in understanding an issue one way rather than another? And a social scientist, it seems to me the burden then becomes one of thinking together through what, you know, it really, I think, does boil down to a political question. It's what kind of analytical frames are adequate to the conditions that you've just described.
So there is a significant volume of works, let's say by Mahatma Gandhi, Acharya Bhave, and all those people who have kind of demonstrated through their work that it is possible for, let's say, rural people to develop independence and upward mobility by knowledge of their craft and then growing it outward. But their knowledge is based upon their daily lives, and you know, they are rooted to their own native context. Whereas globalization, you know, the popular world talks about exactly the opposite. You know, we have to move out of our so-called comfort zone, and we have to make ourselves relevant in some other context. So,
but you know, that's where, just exactly picking up on what you've just said, that a deeper understanding of what actually is going on is in itself important. And you know, for instance, Janaki's work on fisher people and how they used sort of ways of thinking about price and negotiations and so forth, you know, and what does it mean when different technologies come in? It seems to me is exactly an example of the kind of work that needs to be done, is taking very seriously what already exists in relation to, you know, that there are always different ways of organizing sort of social processes. And careful, and that's where the kind of research that attends, and it's difficult research because you can't just go in with a survey. You know, it's the kind of research that requires extended periods actually observing people's practice, both what they do and how they think about what they're doing. You know, what are the theoretical frames that they are deploying that actually we as social scientists need to take very seriously. And so I think that's, but you know, I think that the mainstream of social science does not recognize that as quote unquote scientific. And it seems to me that that's exactly what needs to be challenged.
So, you emphasize the term scientific. So, what exactly do you mean by scientific? So me being a computer scientist, probably my definition of scientific is more like provable,
right,
producible. And I go by that, and when it comes from a social science perspective, I hear a very different definition, and it becomes very, very difficult for these two streams to work together.
You know, the way I think about that, and I don't know if this is helpful or not, is from a more social science perspective. One of the big questions is, how do we think about generality? And I think there are two ways that social scientists think about generality. The one is as representativeness, so that you can only make a claim if it's statistically representative, right? And what that involves is an understanding of generality as working with pre-given bounded units, so that you know what your unit of analysis is. And you have to have a statistically representative sample. And there are undoubtedly a whole lot of social questions for which that kind of research is useful. But I think when we talk about a more ethnographic approach, you know, as we were just talking about here, I think what tends to be, what is very often the argument is, oh, this is just a case study and it's not representative, therefore it's not scientific, right? And therefore gets devalued. Whereas it seems to me, if you think in what I'm calling relational terms, what you're doing is you're refusing to start with pre-given bounded units. Rather, you think about how categories themselves are produced, right? And that instead of case studies, if you think about, if you can start making claims about what are the key relations and connections through which certain processes are operating, that you can actually make general claims, but they are different from the claims, the sort of generalities that rest on representativeness. It's an understanding of generality based on interconnection. And it requires different kinds of data, and it requires a different kind of theoretical framework. Does that answer the question?
What are these claims based on? I mean, the basis of these claims, if we want to verify, you come up with some generalities. So I want to verify those claims. How do I verify? So,
I'm trying to think of an example. You know, the one that springs to mind is when I was doing this research on Taiwanese industrialists in South Africa. And in 1995, the ANC actually, that was the moment when they opened up the economy and cheap goods started coming in from China, and it was knitwear. And I remember going to, and the Taiwanese industrialists kept on complaining that they were paid, that wages in South Africa were too high. And the African women workers were complaining bitterly because the wages were so low. Taiwanese were paying lower wages than South African firms in textiles. So when these goods started coming, you know, they were saying, these Taiwanese industrialists would open up these packages in front of me. They're saying, look, this is made by our aunties and uncles and cousins who went to China instead of coming to South Africa. And we can sell these, they are coming in at prices below the costs of production in South Africa. And this proves that we are paying wages that are too high. So what I did was there was actually Yotian Ching was a classmate of Balaji's, was doing research on Taiwanese industrialists in China, and she gave me very detailed wage data. So I could compare, to some degree, wages in labor-intensive industries in China with those in the town where I was working. And so here's what I discovered, which if you take market exchange rates, then wages in South Africa, in this little town, were twice those in China. So on one level, the Taiwanese industrialists were correct. But if instead of market exchange rates, you took purchasing power parity, what people could actually buy with their wages, the wages in South Africa were 40% below those in China, in the same kinds of factories. So this is not statistically representative, but then I tried to make an argument about what this reflects is actually much broader histories of dispossession, of the particular forms of capitalism in South Africa, in comparison with very different histories of land redistribution in China. So I think I was able to make a series of general claims that somebody could come along and say, well, if we take wages, you know, in another part of South Africa or another part of China, you get a different story. But I would challenge anybody to do that, actually. So that's an example of what I think is a general claim that you can make through a relational understanding. Okay.
Any other questions? Okay, let's say thank you to Gillian and give her a big hand for this excellent.
Thank you so much. And I would just like to thank you for this has just been incredibly helpful to me. So thank you so much.